Hello, everyone. This is Eva Norluck-Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm very pleased today to welcome you to this interview with yoga therapist and author Richard Miller. Richard joins us today to talk about the concept of resilience and how we can nourish resiliency and well-being in our yoga and meditation practices so that we can embody these qualities in a deeper and more profound way when we are off our mats and back in daily life. Many of you know Richard for the important work he has done developing the therapeutic applications of yoga, particularly in regards to stress management and the treatment of traumatic stress disorder. Over the past 45 years, Richard has developed a program for promoting deep relaxation and healing, restoring resilience and well-being, and even more profoundly, awakening to our essential wholeness and the true nature. And he calls this program iRest, for integrative restoration and Yoga Nidra meditation. Research has shown the effectiveness of the iRest program to promote resiliency and well-being while reducing stress, anxiety, insomnia, chronic pain, depression, and much more. And the iRest program is really a synthesis of Eastern and Western practices that help us release negative emotions and thoughts and calm our nervous system and foster greater resilience. Richard, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Eva. Lovely to be with you today.
So, we're here to talk about the concept of resilience, which seems to be an important new buzzword in the field of psychology these days.
Absolutely.
And I remember back from my days of studying psychology that the concept of hardiness was very prominent back then. And researchers were asking why it is that if you take a group of people who are exposed to the same life event, some people, they just breeze through it like nothing happened, and some develop really deep psychological scars or even physical illness as a result of the stress and the trauma. And so back then, the concept was referred to as hardiness, with the idea being that some people are more psychologically hardy than others.
Mhm.
So tell us about the concept of resilience. Is that another word for the same thing?
I love that term, hardiness. I think resiliency, indeed, yes, is another word we could use to replace hardiness. Resiliency, the research that's being done on resiliency probably is echoing and furthering the research that was done earlier on hardiness and taking it another step further, where we're showing that resiliency is actually hardwired into us. We're born with it, but that capacity can be diminished through conditioning as we grow up in our family, our culture, and in the world, or it can be enhanced. So, what we're looking at these days is how can we actually enhance or grow this capacity either from very early on, uh, so we're growing it as we grow, or now in our later part or middle part of our lives to grow it when it may have become diminished through experiences we've had, either the stresses and strains of life or traumas that we may have experienced. As you know, I'm working a lot with military who've experienced tremendous trauma, and we're helping them regain a sense of resiliency and stability where it may have been diminished through experiences they had. So indeed, resiliency, I think, is a wonderful word, but it echoes very much the same concept as hardiness.
Yeah. And you're trained as a yoga teacher, yoga therapist, and also as a psychologist?
I'm a trained yoga teacher, yoga therapist, also a psychologist. I hold actually two licenses, one as a psychologist and one as a marriage and family therapist. Yes.
And how did you get interested, particularly in working with resilience and building resilience?
Well, how do we any of us get interested in something? I think underneath it's really a mystery how it all arises, but I can look at certain turning points in my life where I would say I had lost that sense of resiliency and I was looking at ways to regain it. And in 1970, I was introduced to the practices of yoga and meditation and pranayama. And what I discovered through those was an exquisite form that could help me regrow and regain that sense of resiliency. And specifically along the way, the practices that are now incorporated, we know as Yoga Nidra, and that I've built into the iRest program, specifically 10 basic core practices that um, help us regain, nourish, and really grow strong resiliency within ourselves.
Hmm, interesting. And you already talked about this a little bit, but tell us why there is a difference. Is it, you said we're all born with resilience, but does it differ from person to person, like how much resilience we bring with us into this lifetime? Or is it all kind of like the social conditioning, the experiences that we have?
It's an interesting and fascinating question you're asking. What we're discovering is the capacity for resilience is hardwired into us from birth. That capacity, as I said before, can be enhanced or diminished by the experiences we live through as a young child, as an adult. Um, what we're also seeing, because a lot of studies being done on trauma and post-traumatic stress specifically, is that there are perhaps specific genes in our DNA structure that can be turned off, but wonderfully they can be returned back on. And so while we genetically have that wiring in us, again, through our experiences, those genes can potentially be turned off. So we lose a sense of resiliency. The beauty is through our neuroplasticity that we know now is possible, we can turn back on those structures. And we actually see in some of the MRI studies that have been done and we're doing is certain experiences we have can actually diminish or grow structures in the brain. So, say through meditation, practices of yoga, nidra, and yoga, we can actually grow and thicken the neocortex. We can reduce the structures that, say, hold us hostage to negative emotions. We can grow and actually thicken the structures that help us regain a sense of perspective, ability to see context. And we can turn on, say, the chemicals that help reduce depression and anxiety, and turn on the chemicals that enhance a sense of well-being in our body.
Hmm. Yeah. So I'm curious about what level this plays out on in whether it has to do with the interpretation of the experiences. We all have heard this, saying that, is the glass half empty or half full? Some people see it as half empty, some people see it as half full. So does it have to do with the how we interpret the things that happen to us, or does it have to do with just our basic sense of well-being, as you said, that kind of cause us to not take things so seriously?
I think, like anything, it's always a matter of many elements feeding into it. So I think that does entail at times a shift in perspective where we were seeing the glass as half empty, and now we realize there's something within us that really does feel half full. What I try to actually show people is there's something in us that's never half empty. It's always full and whole. It can be forgotten. It can go so far into the background we lose touch with it. Part of the practices that I teach are to pull it back into the foreground so that we see that no matter the circumstance we may have lived through that diminished our sense of well-being and brought us to seeing the glass half empty, we recognize now there was always something here. It's never been hurt, harmed, or injured. It is always whole. So I would say the glass is actually always full. But, I think it's a combination of recognizing that, um, the change of perspective that that can entail, but it also entails a certain recognition that we need to keep feeding that understanding. It's not like we can just turn the light switch on and it stays on. For most people, when they have that recognition of this inner state of well being and wholeness, it's like the light switch gets turned on, they recognize it, but then the light switch turns off. And actually, this is what we see in the studies on meditators and yogis. When we meditate or we're doing our practice, we can actually turn the switch on and really feel it. But when we stop the practice, for most people, that switch turns off through continued, what I call the three P's: patience, persistence, and perseverance. In other words, a daily practice. We actually nourish parts of our brain that eventually that light turns on. And the metaphor that I use is somebody gets in there, rewires everything, and now you can toggle the switch up and down, but it stays lit on. No matter whether we're on the mat practicing or we're in life going about our daily activities, that sense of wholeness and well being stays lit up. And the beauty is then we find ourselves in a very challenging circumstance where before we didn't have the resiliency to weather it and we get overwhelmed by it, enmeshed in it. Now we have a certain quality of resiliency. So even in the midst of an intensity of life, that sense of resiliency and well-being, and I would even say a deep quality of joy stays present throughout, turned on.
Yeah, yeah. And I think most people who have practiced yoga over a period of time have had that exact experience when they, very often you go to yoga class, you may be tired, you may be stressed, you may be struggling with a specific problem that's bothering you, and you do your practice and you go out and it's like everything is different, and what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle all of a sudden doesn't seem like such a big deal.
Right.
And it's such a common experience, but as you say, it actually in the longer term has very profound implications for how we approach life and how we interact, in a sense, with the world around us.
It also has, I think, deep implications for how we practice because I know when I first came to the practices of yoga, at the end of the very first practice I ever engaged in yoga back in 1970, that switch turned on. I had a major glimpse of that deep wholeness. And then a couple of days later, it's like the switch got turned off, and I'm going, how do I get that back? It felt like something magic happened. So then I started exploring different practices, and I realized some practices don't turn the switch on, and others enable that switch to be turned on. And so I think it's how we practice as matters as much as what we do practice. And it's part of what I'm trying to do through courses like you're offering me to do here. It's what are the practices that actually enhance, and what are some of the ways we need to keep in mind as we're practicing that actually can enhance and not diminish inadvertently that sense of resiliency and well-being.
Interesting. And sort of are trained as a psychologist and work within the framework of Western psychology, but I know that you also have very deep roots in yogic philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of non dualism, which, of course, takes this to a much wider level. Could you speak about that and with your own experiences about that?
Sure. Uh, what I love is the practices of yoga, which go back thousands and thousands of years. Their technology, we might say, far outshines the Western views of psychology. But by knowing the Western views of psychology, we can see things in the Eastern teachings that we might not have otherwise recognized. So I realize in the teachings, everything that I know as a Western psychologist, is in those teachings. I'm just using in a way, my spotlight or searchlight or understanding of Western psychology to pull those out and enhance them in a certain way. Um, there is a difference in psychology and, say, the yogic teachings, especially the yogic teachings of non-dualism. In psychology, it's predicated on a sense of separation. I'm a separate self, you're a separate self, and there's distance between us and between the trees and the plants and the universe. Yoga and non-dualism specifically acknowledge that sense of uniqueness that you are and the uniqueness of me as a personality and differences between oaks and maple trees and different plants. But it's predicated on the understanding that there's a deeper essence here that we all share in common. It's a kind of a mystery out of which all of life arises that can undo that sense of separation. In psychology, it emphasizes a sense of individuation, a sense of becoming a resilient, operational system that I can do the social thing and I can operate into the world and I can feel a good sense of well being in myself as a separate individual. What we see, though, with people who become very deeply individuated, they often feel something is still missing. There's a vital piece that hasn't been touched. The yogic teachings now address that other piece, that deeper mystery that is that essential essence that we all share in common that undoes that sense of separation in its final analysis and really does help us awaken to something that transcends our individuality, doesn't deny it, but adds a whole new understanding that I would say here is the ending of suffering. Now we come into contact with not just a psychological and physical resiliency, but I would say a deep spiritual resiliency that really does allow us, no matter the situation, whether it's a stress, a trauma, or we might say the dying process when we're dying, that allows us to navigate it with joy, a sense of deep well being, a core sense of vitality. And I love how then the Western view and the yogic view come together in a very complementary way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, in a sense, it was like the yogis guided us to a way to connect to this essence of life and the pranic life force that, once we're in touch with that, it informs everything and enlivens everything and, in a sense, brings nourishment to everything. So it's very beautiful.
And I think what the Eastern teachings sometimes don't address is our humanness. How do we take these incredible understandings and insights and weave them into our human life of relationships, emotions, daily thoughts, the stresses and strains of daily life? Western psychology is so beautiful because it teaches that human level of how do we meet, greet, welcome our emotions, our thoughts. When we bring the Eastern teachings together of wholeness with the Western understanding of dealing with our humanness at a daily level, now we have an exquisite technology. And I think this perhaps is what we as Westerners are adding to the Eastern teachings, not just that discovery and awakening of our wholeness and our non-separateness, but how to weave it into our daily relationships, our interactions with our children, at the workplace, so that we're living yoga not just on the mat, but off the mat in daily life.
Not just on the mountain in the cave.
Absolutely. In the cave, in the mountain, on the mountain, everywhere.
Now, in your work with iRest, you have worked with a lot of people who, suffer from serious traumatic stress disorder. So, give us an example of what you have observed in terms of how building this fostering this greater level of resiliency can help a person?
Trauma has a number of deep impacts on a person's life. One of the things it often does is it breaks a sense of connection with self and world. So people come away from deep trauma, especially when it's come innumerable times like we might find on the battlefield. But even people who've been through car accidents or even someone who's walking down the street and finds themselves suddenly on the ground with a broken ankle or whatever. It can lead to a sense of disconnection both with ourself and the world around us. And that can give rise to symptoms that we see, say, with military, where they're suffering from anxiety, depression, but also insomnia. They don't sleep well, or they have pain that they can't find a way to navigate. So when we give these teachings like iRest, Yoga Nidra, one of the first things we hear often is, um, that's the first time I've slept through the night since I was in Vietnam or since I was in Iraq. So sleep becomes something that they start to regain. And we know that attaining good sleep turns on our immune system. It starts healing us in a way that if we don't get restful sleep, we don't heal well. And that's the reason why when people don't sleep well, they'll often get sick because their immune system, for instance, gets compromised. One of the things I also often hear, even after their first session with Yoga Nidra, is they'll often say, I feel like I just came home. And they discovered that part of themselves that wasn't injured, wasn't healed, that they knew before they went into the situation that gave rise to the trauma. And it's like they come home and they regain a sense of connection with themselves. They start to become friendly with these different emotions and experiences and memories. And as one veteran said, it's not like you're erasing my memories, but the emotions that I had to them, the overwhelm that I felt, I can't find that anymore. It's like it's disappeared. So I remember what I went through, but I don't have the emotional charge to it anymore. So there are a lot of different immediate effects and long-term effects because we know one of the things that trauma does is it turns on or lights up, we might say, the whole limbic system in our brain that then makes us held hostage to our emotions. And so people who go through trauma often are very reactively angry, sad, they get overwhelmed easily, they lose perspective. And the teachings actually, the practices help calm and soothe that limbic system, calm it down, help them regain a harmonious nervous system, and they feel again that sense of balance coming back into their lives.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. So it really is almost like a rewiring of the brain, like you were saying earlier.
I would say everything you said, except I'd lose the word almost. I would say it actually is a rewiring of the brain because we actually see it on the MRIs, and people actually feel it in their life that they've been rewired in some way, or to use our modern day language, it's like their computer has rebooted. The system software that was offline comes back online, and they're really off and running back into their life.
Yeah, yeah. So for people who are not so familiar with iRest, tell us how it's different from like a yoga asana practice or even like a restorative yoga
Sure.
practice.
Yoga Nidra, we might say, is a form of meditation, and it's not based, say, on an asana based practice. However, what I've learned is how to integrate it. Say, if we're doing a movement practice like asana or hatha yoga or tai chi or anything else, we can actually integrate the principles into that practice. If we're doing pranayama, we can introduce it and integrate it. So we can integrate it into any practice. It's a complementary practice that supports any practice that we're already doing. It's a form of, I would say, meditation that encompasses um, holding a very strong intention. It entails a sense of connection with life itself that's giving birth and living us. That what I tell people, they can discover a sense of value, meaning, and purpose just by getting reconnected to that pulse of life that's throbbing in us. But it also goes further. It's a practice that actually proactively is showing us how to work with our emotional life, our cognitive thinking life of thoughts and memories and images. It's also working with, in yoga, we know them as the Brahma Viharas, these four attitudes of joy, deep quality of connected friendship with ourself, compassion, both with ourself and in the world, and a deep stillness of equanimity. And it's showing that these already exist within us, and the practices of Yoga Nidra help draw them out to the surface and nourish it. One of the things we know both in the practices of yoga and specifically in the practice of Yoga Nidra is through our practices, we can activate these, I call them resources, like well being, resiliency, joy, compassion. We can activate them, but it's not just enough to activate them. We've got to learn how to nourish and, in a way, integrate them. And that's what I love about, say, the practices specifically of Yoga Nidra and iRest as a secular practice that I've developed. Asana is something we're doing in a way on the mat, as we do with Yoga Nidra, but then we're learning how to take it off the mat and keep nourishing in a way and flourishing these aspects in the midst of our daily life. So it's a really a complementary approach to any practice we do on the mat, but it's showing us how to keep moving with those practices off the mat. So a large part of Yoga Nidra isn't just the practice, but how do we integrate this into every daily aspect of our life?
Interesting. So it sounds like you've taken the original Yoga Nidra practice and developed it even further with the iRest program.
Well, what I noticed early on is the practices that I had been taught, that I had received from the Eastern teachings, came with particular, what I call Eastern archetypes, particular images, particular perspectives, beliefs. So what I saw as a Westerner, a humorful way of saying it is, I don't like somebody telling me what to see and what to do. I want to discover that for myself. So what I did early on is I started looking, what could I, in a way, take off that belonged to the culture of India or the East, and then look at Yoga Nidra as the base core practices that anybody could practice, irrespective of their culture, religion, philosophy, lifestyle, age. And so I made it into a very secular form of self inquiry that anybody can do. And I like the idea that, as, say, a teacher of yoga or Yoga Nidra, that if I'm standing by the door as my students are leaving, that they're whispering in my ear, thank you today for making this practice just for me. And irrespective, so taking away the kind of religiosity and the spirituality and all of that and making it into a very secular delivery, we might say, or series of inquiries that a person does while they're doing the practice, we can meet a person right where they are, however they are, and we're not trying to instill a new set of beliefs. We're not trying to inculcate into them something. We're helping them pull out what's already there and bring it to the surface. So people often say, I'm a fundamentalist Christian, or I come from a Judeo Christian background, or I'm a Muslim. Your practices are actually enhancing the way that I live myself into the world. They're not telling me that I should be different. They're actually showing me how to be even more what I am.
A bit of Christian, a bit of Muslim. Yeah,
Correctly.
yeah, yeah.
Correct.
That's beautiful. Richard, you have a course coming up on
I
Yoga
do indeed.
UOnline. creating greater resilience. So tell us about what you will be covering and what everyone will be learning.
Yeah. The course is being done as two parts, and so I'm going to be looking at the first part and a little bit in the second part. What's the actual neuroscience of resiliency? What are some of the studies and the research that help us understand what's going on when we do these practices? And I have found when I show the neuroscience, people often will take the practices at a deeper level. They're more willing to participate when we understand, why am I doing this? Again, as Westerners, I don't think we like the idea of trust me. We like the idea, let me find out for myself. Show me, help me discover it. So I'll be talking about the neuroscience. Then I'm going to be looking at specific practices. So how do we help identify and grow an inner core sense of well-being? How do we grow and nourish this inner sense of value, meaning, and purpose that's beside what we do in the world as a job or our activities? Some deep core sense of inner meaning, value, purpose, well-being. So I'm going to be looking at how can we identify and grow these. Then I'm looking at the core aspects of the practice, our relationship to our body, our senses, our emotions, and our mind. What are specific, I call them proactive exercises we can do, practices that we can interweave into any practices that we're already doing, like Hatha Yoga, but also as separate practices themselves, and how do we take those into our daily life? I'm also going to be exploring these four Brahma Viharas. How do we activate and nourish joy, not as dependent on a situation, but as independent? So we carry it with us in the midst of any activity or circumstance we're experiencing. And then I'm going to be also introducing the actual complete practice, I would say, of Yoga Nidra as a complete practice. So it has individual components we can utilize as separate practices, and we have a kind of a core practice of 10 steps that I'll be talking about. So the course, I'll be giving some talks with some PowerPoint slides where I'll be showing different aspects of it. I'll be engaging people right when we're in the course with some practices, so we're doing them together while we're together. And then I'm going to be offering a number of downloadable practices that people can do in between our talks or after they've taken the course that are exemplative of these different aspects: nourishing joy, nourishing value, meaning and purpose, nourishing well-being, and proactively learning how to meet our emotions and our thoughts in the midst of our practices on the mat and off the mat. So really fundamental core practices that help nourish resiliency and well-being in this moment, every moment of our life.
Sounds like a wonderful, very practical, and very profound course.
You know, you really speak to that. To me, it's got to be practical. I'm not just a talking head. I'm more interested in the experience than just talking about it. So I want to share what I have found and speak from it and invite the listeners into their own experience of it. That said, I think it is also important. Sometimes we talk about things like the neuroscience that shows how it works, but ultimately it is our firsthand experience that I'm after, so that we're really feeling and experiencing it in our daily life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Richard, thank you so much. We are very much looking forward to having you as a guide on that very, very important journey.
Well, I look forward to joining everybody on the course.
Okay, wonderful. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, Jacob.
Blessings.
Bye bye.